Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Comics Lair. This evening, we're discussing superheroes as vigilantes. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. We'll start by asking everyone on the panel to go around and tell us a little bit about themselves. Jenny, we'll start with you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Swartz Levine. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and also a professor of English at Lake Erie College in Painesville, Ohio. And I've loved comics since I was a little girl, and I'm delighted to be here tonight.
Van?
Hey, I'm Van Allen Plexico. I'm a professor of political science and history at Southwestern Illinois, but I am the creator and editor and co-writer of 2 books on Marvel's Avengers, Assembled and Assembled 2, and I'm the author of 9 superhero novels, the Sentinels series, which has their first comic book just come out. It's on Kickstarter right now, but it's already funded, so yay! Called Pulsar Blind Date, where Pulsar goes on a blind date. Imagine that. And I have hosted the Marvel DC trivia battle at Dragon Con for like 21 years now, I believe.
Wow.
Bishop?
I'm Bishop O'Connell. I'm an author of urban fantasy and alternative history. And I have been into comics probably, since the early 80s. Starting off with the ones that usually get people pulled in with Captain America and X-Men when it got really big in the 80s and 90s was my particular drug of choice. I'm looking forward to this. I also have interesting with Jenny. My degree is in philosophy, so this topic really is a particular interest to me because I like to look deeper into things. And
okay, Jim.
I am Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, urban fantasy, bit of horror, bit of contemporary, bit of this, that, and the other. I also write nonfiction. I've been in media. I've done a whole bunch of other stuff. And from a comics perspective, I grew up on comics. Dad got me into a lot of the DC stuff early on. Batman, a lot of those sorts of things. And I've always been a big fan of the anti-hero and a lot of the study around Vigilante. At what point do our heroes or anti-heroes, when do they cross particular lines? So I like the darker ones.
And for those of you who are new to the Comics Lair, I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books, and I also write various genres of romance. And with Jeannie Adams, I co-write the Outcast Station science fiction mystery adventure series. I've been into comic books since I was 8 years old. Mostly superheroes, starting with DC. I know for some of you this is heresy, but I didn't discover Marvel until I was in college. But it's a pleasure to put these panels together and talk to everybody, so let's get started with that. I guess the first thing we should consider is what is a vigilante. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary says, a vigilante is a member of a volunteer committee, although I suppose it could be an individual as well, organized to suppress and punish crime summarily as when the processes of the law are inadequate. Broadly, a self-appointed doer of justice. Does anybody want to take issue with that or amplify it?
I think it's grown beyond just that simple definition now. I think it's historically speaking, there were kind of some fine fuzzy lines between lynch mobs and vigilantes. In the distant and not so distant history of our country in particular. So I think that's probably best. To me, that comes off as best case definition, putting the best possible spin on it.
Well, I think the thing I would really want to highlight in the definition is that you work outside the law and not alongside the law. You have to have decided the law is not able to do the job on its own, or it is not adequate to the job, or it is not properly prosecuting the case, and therefore you kind of go off on your own, or you get somebody who is a vigilante to go off on their own for you, who works outside the law. And that's why superheroes are such an interesting way to look at vigilantes, because some are vigilantes and some work within the law, and and then there's a lot of gray area.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But I mean, in a lot of ways, almost every superhero we could possibly consider is, at least at some point in their history, a vigilante, because they all seem to think in some ways, even though some of them are sanctioned and work with the law, that the law for some reason is inadequate. So therefore it needs that assistance. And when you first brought up this panel topic, I started thinking, well, I don't know what we're going to, which one we're going to talk about, because we could talk about all of them in some way, shape, or form.
Well, and I think the other question comes even from those that are sanctioned is, at what point do they cross a line?
Right.
Because even ones that are sanctioned at some point go and say, this one has gone beyond my moral compass, and I'll take the hit for the fact of doing what I think I need to do. But I mean, if we look at historically that idea of, vigilantes, we usually see those presented in, the old Wild West, places where law enforcement was really negligible to non-existent. And I think we also see a lot of the same sort of legacy there with the superheroes, except in a lot of the time what we see is they're dealing with law enforcement that is just as corrupt as the criminals that they're dealing with, and a lot of the time that's the way we go with it and explain it. And I think that's a big part of the setup as to why we go with some of the heroes we have and let them do some of the things that we let them do.
Jenny used a really important word there that I think we need to highlight, which is inadequate, right? You said that because the law is inadequate. I think that there's completely different ways that the law can be inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
There is the Batman way, which is that they've got the ability to take care of crime in Gotham City if they want to, but either through corruption or just for whatever various reasons, they don't do it. Then there's like the inadequate of Galactus is attacking.
Right.
What are the cops going to do? They are physically inadequate to deal with this threat. You've got to have the Fantastic Four. So there's different ways of being inadequate, and it could be morally inadequate. It can be physically inadequate, power level inadequate. There's a lot of different ways that you would have a need, and we can debate need, right, for a vigilante type person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that ties into the whole debate of, does Gotham City have the Joker because Batman is there? Is Batman a magnet for characters like the Joker? Or does the existence of characters like the Joker or the Riddler or Two-Face necessitate a Batman?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost chicken and egg from that standpoint.
You made me, I made you. Hey, well,
Yes.
Well, when Superman first appeared in Action Comics #1, one of the most popular radio programs going was The Lone Ranger.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the first character I remember being interested in as a child who was a vigilante. The Clayton Moore, I didn't hear the radio program, but the Clayton Moore Lone Ranger black and white TV show was rerun all through my childhood at intervals. And it was mostly the corruption, like law enforcement is hamstrung and can't do this. So you need the Lone Ranger and Tonto to ride in and take care of the problem. But it's, as best I remember, there were also times when the scope of the problem needed a guy on a white horse with silver bullets and a guy on I think Tonto's horse was called a paint, who knew the local ways. And so he really kind of encapsulates both. And I wonder if people's view of superheroes was in part shaped by that cultural strain. What do you all think? Yes, no, maybe?
I think so. I think it's contextual too, because obviously in the time that the Lone Ranger was set, I think it was Jim that said, it was in a time where law was not always available. Where you may have had one sheriff or a marshal covering half a state, so it was the regular thing to employ bounty hunters, or the just loose lawmen who would go and track down criminals to bring them in. I think that's where, like Van brought up with the inadequacies, to where the law just wasn't capable of maintaining the law. So that's where you had the Lone Ranger who kind of tried to come in and fill that role. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the Lone Ranger also a Texas Ranger? Wasn't that at some point?
Started out, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, he was technically law enforcement for a time, but I definitely think that's a start of it, and I think the characters like the Lone Ranger are probably why we have such an initially acceptable tone of taking superheroes as vigilantes and not putting such a negative spin on it. That we from an early age, our culture has shown the necessity and, you know, the virtue of stepping up when needs be.
Well, that's the Zorro radio program came on about 1937, but before that was the Fairbanks Silent Zorro movie, where he had a lair in a cave under the house that was accessed by moving a grandfather clock. I mean, somebody can tell me Bob Kane never saw that movie, but I don't know that I would necessarily buy that. And so it's the same kind of thing. The army was the problem and they needed somebody to handle it. So then we fast forward. Superman, in a way, he is a vigilante, but he's not in the vein of these others because he can leap tall buildings at a single bound and run faster than a locomotive. And so he's kind of outside the framework of the Lone Ranger and Zorro, but he is still a vigilante. I mean, he just goes out and does what Van.
That's because I've always maintained Superman's greatest single ability is his moral compass.
Yes.
Because he could, as we've seen in shows like The Boys, he could very easily be the worst villain there ever was. And nobody, or in Injustice, the miniseries I just paid $100 for, and it doesn't have an ending. But he could be such a villain, but nobody thinks of him as a vigilante first, right? We think of him as the Boy Scout.
Yes.
Because he's so dedicated and so focused on truth, justice, and the American way that he's not the Punisher. That's the flip side, And I mean, I can totally see Lex Luthor's point of view about him, because Lex Luthor's like, this dude is like one mental snap away from being being Hitler on steroids, literally, so you have to depend on his sense of morality or we're all screwed.
Yeah and sort of his innate goodness. And I mean, I was just reading the Superman the son of Kal-El, I can't remember the exact title.
The new John Kent.
Superman. The one with John Kent. And the issue I was reading last night, I think it was number 2, it was Superman and John were having this conversation about how Superman felt as if he couldn't intervene in the world's problems because he was not from Earth. And in some ways that was how it became John's responsibility to intervene and change things in fundamental kinds of ways because he's half human. And that Superman kind of needed to be removed in some ways from that because he didn't want to mess up human affairs. He wanted to save people. He wanted to make people's lives better, but he didn't want to fundamentally change things. And I thought that was a really interesting approach.
Well, and I think that it becomes a really interesting question of trying to balance the fact of, when we're talking about vigilantes, because Superman is not human, he may have been raised as a child by humanity around humans, but all of his capabilities are because of not being human. I think that puts him in a very different perspective where the moral compass is critical. And I think that that's almost a prime directive level of, I'm not going to interfere with how everybody's going to do and develop and do their thing. I just want to stop bad things from happening.
Right.
And I think that becomes a really fine line in terms of, looking at and talking about vigilantism or anything else, is who does your character balance against, and what do they find to be the crises that they're willing to interject in? I think that's a big question.
Well, and it's Superman, I think, is the DC embodiment of the famous Spider-Man line, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
Or was put in the Civil War movie, that if you can do something and you don't, and the bad things happen anyway, it's on you. Right. I think that's a good delineation between the types of superheroes to what is the purpose they're doing. Are they doing something because they feel they have an obligation to, or are they doing something because it's like you've got the Batman that's almost a sense of vengeance against the criminals for what they did to him, or the Punisher. I think that it's the light and the dark side, so to speak.
Yeah, and that goes, I mean, if you think about Kingdom Come and sort of what, sort of the setup there, I mean, we had sort of the superheroes who were having to contain the metahumans because they were just playing around with their powers and messing with humanity just for the fun of it. I mean, it was cruel. So they had to be restrained by, sort of the older Wonder Woman, Batman, and, Superman. And in a lot of ways, I see bunches of parallels between Kingdom Come and sort of the Civil War, both comic and the movie. They share sensibilities.
Mm.
Well, one hero who has a moral compass that's recently gotten him in trouble is Daredevil, because Daredevil used excessive force in a fight and accidentally killed somebody. And if you have not yet read Zdarsky's Daredevil run, you might want to put your fingers in your ears and go la 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 for the next few minutes because we're going to talk about it. But I found that series really interesting because Matt could have gotten out of going to jail, and he went to jail for involuntary manslaughter. And so much of this run has been Matt in jail and the way the city has responded to that. And that's his moral compass. And I don't know that I've ever I can't remember a superhero who made that drastic a decision because of his moral code. Is anybody else got something on that?
I mean, obviously the Man of Steel movie, Superman willingly lets himself be taken into custody.
Right.
Until he decides he doesn't want to be in custody anymore, and
right.
Just snaps the handcuffs and stands off. But yeah, I think that's a great mark though too, because that's sort of putting your money where your mouth is, right? That it's, if you're really about upholding the law, then you can't put yourself above it either.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we see a lot of the time get balanced is when somebody goes too far or an accident happens or something like that happens, that someone is killed or critically injured, does the hero take on the weight of that, and how do they deal with it? If you have the case where Batman and when Barbara Gordon is paralyzed, when you see some of these different things and how the weight comes on, every action has implications. I mean, every action has consequences. And I think that's one of the things that we have to see with the vigilante heroes is how do they deal with the consequences of their actions, especially when those consequences are not ones they anticipated or ones that line up with their goals. I mean, because at the end of the day, if you spend enough time in that environment, there's going to be collateral damage. And likely enough, at some point, that's going to be a sidekick. That's going to be somebody that's close to you. I mean, just the numbers and the statistics say at some point, something's going to happen. And how are you willing to deal with the implications of those actions and the consequences?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody anybody who isn't a kid anyway, is naive enough to believe that some of these big battles that happen in cities, there are not large amounts of collateral damage and death of innocent bystanders. I don't know if anybody here has seen the Hawkeye series yet. It's not really a
first
spoiler.
episode.
It's not really a spoiler, but it opens up that Kate Bishop lives in New York during the attack of New York, and she's just kind of the bystander as it's happening. It's that was always my complaint with the Superman movies was, the destruction porn, that it's like,
yes,
it's my memories of Superman were always when a fight happens, he took the bad guys outside the city. We weren't so big on trying to punch them through buildings and stuff, although that started with the cartoons too, with the Justice League and things like that. But my first cartoons were Super Friends, so
mine too.
Very, very sanitized.
But it is interesting because there are always unforeseen consequences in real life.
Right.
Right now I'm blanking on whether it's in Batman or Detective, because I read them at the same time and then I get them confused. But it's the storyline is that the mayor has had enough of these costume vigilantes. He's going to get rid of all of them. And in the most recent issue I read, he found himself embarrassingly dependent upon Batman. But there was a groundswell of support for, let's get rid of these masked vigilantes. We'll handle it ourselves. It's not going to be a problem. And in the Titans TV series, third season that we just finished, and here again, it might be a spoiler if you haven't seen it. There's a point where the Scarecrow manages to blame the problems in Gotham City on the Titans. And they go in to turn themselves in. And instead of the Barbara and a couple of cops reception they expected, because Barbara's the police commissioner in that show, there's an army of cops in riot gear. And the situation, not surprisingly, goes south. So I guess what I'm leading up to here is, if this were the real world, wouldn't there be a whole lot more of that than there is in the comic books?
Honestly, I don't know, because I think, given our history, that when people get scared, we're willing to accept pretty extraordinary endeavors. Sacrifice. The whole sacrificing freedom for security thing. That if you have a Chitauri invasion, I don't know that you would have too many people complaining about the Avengers stepping up to face them down. You know what I mean? I think it's like Van said before, that it's a matter of what the inadequacy is. That it's when you have the superheroes taking on super villains, I don't think that if that was in this world, I don't think you would get as much pushback. But I think you would definitely have pushback on people like the Punisher, on Batman, people that tackle the average everyday criminals that the police should be handling. That it's like, we don't expect the police to go and resolve issues in Iraq. That's, the army has a specific use, the police has a specific use. I would almost see superheroes as falling into that sort of same spectrum of response.
Well, and speaking of the Punisher, he and Matt have a very interesting conversation in the Daredevil run, which is apparently wrapping up with the next issue, and then there'll be a miniseries and something after that. But the Punisher really holds Matt in contempt, because he just puts these people in jail and then they're out again, and the Punisher solves the problem. And I believe that was his attitude on the Netflix Daredevil show as well. It's like, I'm going to take care of this, and you just go do your little piddly thing, and I'm going to handle it.
Yeah, but at the same time, in the real world, if it's your house that gets destroyed, or as both sort of the Civil War comic and the movie, if it's your kid that gets killed, I think you'd have a very different reaction. And I think Bishop's right. I mean, it's sort of the older, sort of iterations of some of these comics and superheroes, they got taken out of the city. But with sort of the CGI and the ability to sort of do big explosions and all of that kind of stuff, the vigilantism and the violence has become sort of centered, so that you do have buildings falling down and being destroyed. And just, I've sat through so many of them that I get distracted from the plot by just thinking about how many billions of dollars of property damage have been done, let alone how many innocent bystanders, have been killed. If this was real, people might be happy to have been saved, but at the same time, everybody's going to have someone that didn't make it, or a car got dropped on their house or something. So
the loudest voices of protest would be the insurance companies.
Yes. Well, yeah.
And actually, go ahead, Van.
No, go ahead.
Well, so actually, I would kind of counter to the point, because while something's going on, a lot of people are very willing to go and say, okay, yep, go save the day, with that expectation of it's going to not have any implications for them. But once the action's over, I think that we've seen some really good representation of probably what would happen, which is okay, well, they may have saved the city, but they tore up, 20 city blocks. They tore up, they destroyed this, they destroyed that. I mean, going back and watching the movies, I think watching the aftermath of Ultron, with that there, I think they did a really good job of coming and saying, no, people really, okay, great, you saved us, you destroyed the town. We would rather you have saved us without destroying the town. Or inevitably, some degree of people are going to come and say, well, if you weren't here, you wouldn't have created an environment where this could have happened. And again, I think Ultron is a great example of that, because fundamentally it was Stark who created that situation.
Mhm.
I just want to smack those people because I'm like, like in Civil War when they blamed the Scarlet Witch and all the others for what happened. I'm just like, okay, we should have just not showed up and you could have all been killed. How's that? Is that better? Is that what you wanted? That we don't show up at all, right? And then you just deal with it. But I was going to address a minute ago what Bishop was saying. I think that as with most things, it's how it's presented. I mean, there's how vigilantism is presented in the fiction, and there's how it would be presented to the public through the media in that story. So let me start with to us. For the most part, vigilantes are presented to us as the good guys and girls. And so we are given the best possible spin on their motivations and their actions and the repercussions that the writer and the artist can convey to us because it's their story. I mean, I would argue probably the closest into the gray area you really get is the Punisher, maybe Wolverine, but the Punisher, just because that's his shtick, right? Oh, look, I'm so edgy of a vigilante that I'm too vigilante for the vigilante, right? I'm too bad for my own good guy comic book. That's kind of his shtick, So how they are presented to us is a big part of whether we think, oh, yay, vigilante's here, or, oh, no, a vigilante? I'd rather just have the villains without anybody else showing up. And then the other side of the coin, though, inside the story, because, I mean, think about in our world, and I won't go into specifics, but in our world, how we see actions like that depends on what channel we watch, what newspaper we read, what websites we visit, right? We're getting echo chamber for what we self-select. Oh, I want to hear this interpretation. I'm going to watch this channel. I want to see this version of it and be told the good things about it rather than the bad things about it. So I'm going to go to this channel or read this newspaper or this website. Okay, and that's fine. That's just your freedom of choice. But inside the story, the people that are living in that fictional world, they're getting their information, presumably from the media within that world. So when Batman shows up, are they being told heroic crime fighter Batman comes to save the day? Or do you flip over to the other cable channel and they're like, oh, that vigilante Batman is interfering with our great police again. What are we going to do about this, threat or menace, as J. Jonah Jameson would describe, So there's both how we get it as the consumer of the entertainment, but there's also the characters in their world and how they are being told. And that's up to the writer, right? So in other words, there's two layers to it, is what I'm trying to say.
There was a run in Wonder Woman. My time sense has telescoped since the public health crisis began. So I'm not sure if this was last year or the year before.
All the same thing.
Yeah, it was sometime recently. There was a whole storyline in Wonder Woman where she was being sued for property damage that occurred when she would dive in and defend people. And that was like, okay, and it sort of made me think, we don't ever see this. And it's like,
well, Tony Stark would write a check. Right. That was always the end of every Avengers story is Tony Stark writes a check to somebody, right?
Right. Well, in our world, we have the Good Samaritan laws, right? That if you're trying to do, if you're trying to make a genuine effort to help somebody, they can't sue you if something happens. If somebody's car is on fire and you're trying to get them out of the car, and while you're doing it, you dislocate their shoulder, they can't sue you for dislocating your shoulder. I would always imagine that same kind of thing would carry over, that you would have to look at it within the terms of what it was. And like Van said, in that scene in Civil War when Secretary Ross starts showing the examples of all the destruction, yes. I really wanted Black Widow to say, oh yeah, we should have just totally buggered out of that Chitauri event. Then everything would have been fine there. Not like you guys wanted to fire a nuke at the city. The only one is the Sokovia one. I could say, yeah, that's on you guys because Tony, you made Ultron and you went off the deep end. But the rest was like, if they hadn't been there, bad stuff still would have happened.
There is a scene in Avengers 181, I believe, where Henry Peter Gyrick has the Avengers all together, and he's like, you've been doing this wrong and that wrong, and you're just screwing everything up and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to take away your clearance. I'm going to take away your security. I'm going to take away everything. You're a bunch of menaces. And the Beast, there's like all of a sudden they get word there's like a monster out on the main road just smashing buildings. And the Beast breaks a table leg off of a table, hands it to Gyrick and says, here you go, buddy.
Well, and I think that's an important thing is when the antagonist, when the conflict, when the problem is presented, is that the hero and the way they approach it typically has to be seen as the only response that would be reasonable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here, though. If you look at the Punisher, when Frank Castle comes to town, it's all about body count, mm-hmm. because he's going to fix that problem. It may create another one, but I'm going to put that problem in the ground, right. and I mean, it's that level of force. If we look at Avengers, if we look at something like that, where it is Chitauri invasion, okay, yep, alien invasion, we're probably going to have to tear some stuff up to save the city, because that's an active military and an army on the ground firing ordnance. You're going to have to fire back to do anything about it. I mean, it's meeting adequate levels of force with adequate levels of force.
Okay, well, what happens after that? Oh, did somebody want to say something before?
No.
Okay, well, okay. Let's say Batman steps in, or Daredevil steps in, or Wolverine steps in, and they beat the living daylights out of the bad guy and truss them up, and here come the cops. Who puts the case together? I mean, that's not the end of it. The cops can't keep them in jail unless there's evidence that a crime has been committed, and that evidence can withstand scrutiny in court. So we don't see much of that either.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I just pictured in my head Law and Order Avengers.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
No, well, I mean, in some ways, that's kind of the premise of Powers, right? I mean, Bendis's Powers is, what do they do as they're trying to police a superhero dominated city, and how is it that the law actually intersects with what the superheroes are doing, and how can the sanctioned police actually kind of prosecute those cases and see them on their way through? And and I mean, if you go back to Top 10, I mean, it's you see those kind of things there too. And I think that those are really interesting discussions for exactly what you've been talking about is, all right, what do we do now that the superheroes have come in, done their thing, dropped off the villains, and now what,
Well, I always used to laugh because I would have, even as a child, I had these thoughts. Spider-Man bundles them up in a nice thing, sticks a note on them, and leaves them hanging from a lamppost.
Right.
Police show up. Where they're going to go do and say, well, that note's definitive evidence, and that's going to be the testimony that locks them away to get their 90 days, or whatever the case may be. And because we sort of have that assumption of the moral right of, well, since it was Spider-Man that tied him up, we know that he's a good guy and these guys did the wrong thing and they're just going to confess. No, they're just going to go and say, wasn't me.
Well, that's where, the benefit of if it's a supervillain you bust, they're not only going to confess to it, they're going to start monologuing about it, about what a great and brilliant plan it was. So there you're covered. But the small
thing wasn't for that meddling superhero.
Exactly. Yeah. What are your due process rights if you happen to be a supervillain that's been strung up outside the the police station by Spider-Man? So.
Right.
Well, and then there's the old saying that if the Joker would just stop boasting about what he's doing and just shoot Batman, mm-hmm. it'd be game over.
Right.
But the character doesn't ever do that.
I mean, that's part of his drive, right? Is he's an agent of chaos.
Right.
It's for him. It's not about the crimes or anything else. It's about just messing everything up. And you can't, it would be the end of messing things up if he got rid of the counterbalance to him.
Where's the fun then?
Right.
Well, and he's going to end up in Arkham anyway.
Right.
No matter what he gets charged with, he's going to end up in Arkham anyway.
Joker needs to commit a crime in Florida is what he needs to do. Be it. Or Texas.
I saw something that was actually today on social media. Somebody was posted something about that they were tired of this trope that when aliens invade or a supervillain attacks, that everybody just runs and cowers. And they said, as a society, as a people, we don't have a very good sense of self protection when something really bad is happening. That, like, if an alien invasion happens, you can just see people saying, all right, you know what, I ain't going out like this, and grabbing a table leg and just going out there, to take it on. It's I think there would be a certain amount of that, especially geographically, depending upon where you were at. I mean, it's you get some of these supervillains that roll into the wrong neighborhoods in some cities, and it just isn't going to end well for them.
I will openly say, if somebody decided to roll up and invade the mountain place, that's not going to go well.
There was something I read, I think it was a science fiction novel. And the Germans decided that they wanted an empire back. And they attacked the United States, and they started their invasion, I think, in either Brooklyn or the Bronx. And it was an alternate history. I can see the cover except for the title, naturally. So, but that was interesting too. But one thing we've been kind of talking about all evening has been Captain America: Civil War, because that's kind of the heroes who want to work with the government, the heroes who refuse to or can't work with the government. And that's the clash of the movie. And it's one of my favorites in the series because so much of what's at stake for the characters is so intensely personal. Mm-hmm. So what do you all feel about the accords that the Avengers were asked to sign?
I personally liked the spin of the accords because it was an optional move. Whereas in the comic books, if you were a mutant or any kind of a superpowered person, you had no option. You either registered or you went to jail. Yep. And I like that they delved on it a little bit when Tony went off the deep end talking about Wanda, that they don't provide visas to weapons of mass destruction. That kind of dipped its toe into the comic books. That was always my issue in the comics with, the Mutant Registration Act series that they kept trying to push, and then eventually, with the Civil War, it's one thing when it says, okay, if you want to be a superhero, if you want to fight crime, you've got to register with the government, or you have to become a government agent. It's when you took that choice away about something somebody has no choice over. I can see that with the option of, it's compulsory for people like Tony Stark, Batman, Punisher, the people who are average, normal people who just through other means superpower themselves. But if you're, Rogue, Havoc, Wolverine, or somebody that you're born with these powers and you had no choice in the making, I think the encounter that Tony Stark has in the comic books with Jessica Jones is just absolutely spot on, because she starts talking about, not only did I not have a choice in this was done to me. Mm-hmm. And, I have no interest in being a superhero anymore, but now you're telling me I have to go and register for this. And of course, Tony being Tony makes the step talking about, something like "you people" or something in front of Nick Cage. And Nick Cage does not react well, but that was always, I like the Accords version of it better. I still thought it was messed up and a bad idea, but I think that was the more reasonable of the options.
Well, and personally, I would be very challenged. I mean, let's face it. If we were in that world, people who have no capabilities, no powers, no nothing, and especially when you're looking at people that are powered, that have the ability to hide behind a mask and a suit and everything else, that's going to make even average people nervous. Even if it's Superman that comes out and has these great alien powers and alien capabilities, you want to believe that the government can do something about that and rein him in under control, and they've got his house address. Whereas if I am that hero, I don't really want to trust anybody, because if I have to disclose my identity and I have to register and I do all of these things, then we know within the comics and within life, there's always a way to get that information. That's no longer secure. Once you've told someone, once someone knows, it gets out. And so that takes away a lot of the power, a lot of the capability of that person, of that hero. And not to mention the fact you never know which way political winds are going to change on a given day. I mean, I absolutely can reason why somebody who may be a hero, a powered person, something along those lines, even if all they want to do is sit on their couch and eat Cheetos all day long, if that's all that they're doing, but they have those capabilities, doesn't say that one day the wrong thing happens, they get mad, and all of a sudden, they turn big, they turn green, and they go smash. I mean, it's fear going both ways, and that's the controlling factor always, is who's afraid of what, and both sides have something to be fearful of.
Yeah. And I think that at least for me, the distinction kind of is, in the world of the comics, totally on Team Cap as far as registration or not registration. But if superheroes were real and in the real world, I'm pretty sure I'd be on Team Iron Man, because, we want to know, who these people are. And in some ways, by having them register, it brings them back it turns them into superpowered police, right? I mean, it makes them sanctioned agents of law enforcement. And, but as Jim said, I mean, if you're the superhero in question, do you really want them to be able to find you? I mean, that's the entire point of the masks, right? So.
And not even you, but the people close to you.
It's close to you, exactly.
I mean, that was always the point of the secret identity. It wasn't about protecting you. It was about protecting your loved ones and those closest to you.
Yeah, and it has real implications, because I mean, in the comic, I mean, sort of the fallout from, Peter taking off his mask and people knowing his identity publicly, I mean, that winds up affecting things with Aunt May, with Mary Jane. I mean, it goes on and on.
It's an intractable problem. I mean, because both sides, as you guys said, have very good points, and there's no easy answer. I mean, because for every reason that these people deserve privacy and their civil liberties and all that, on the other hand, they are doing something that normal people can't do. And if their superpower is I carry around a hydrogen bomb, I kind of want the government to keep track of them,
Yeah.
And so it's just really tough. And I wrestled with it when the comics were coming out in a bad way, because I was agreeing with Cap, but I'm the biggest Iron Man fan in the world. And I'm like, well, I have to be on Iron Man's side. I don't care if he's Hitler. I'm on Iron Man's side. I just have to be, So I'm like going against my own morals and beliefs to support, that. But, and, that was, by the way, that was one thing funny about that story, was that they swore up and down before it came out that, look, this is a 50-50 question, and there's not a good guy and a bad guy, and Iron Man and Cap are both equally right. And then as soon as that story started coming out, man, Iron Man was the biggest villain in the Marvel universe. And I'm reading it going, man, they can't even go 3 issues without somebody being the supervillain and somebody being the hero. And I'm just like, oh, this is so unfair.
Yeah, but it was eventually Iron Man's side that really won. And admittedly, it's because Cap laid down the shield and wound up in some ways agreeing with him. But, but it's also been interesting to me that sort of like the fact that it's Cap that is the one that is anti-registration, when he is sort of the biggest proponent, sort of the most obvious representative of the government, because I mean, he's Team USA.
But I see, and that's where I think that the movie really hit on some good points too, because it plays up the fact that Cap lived through some really not pretty times in history.
Right. Yes.
It acknowledged the fact that Cap was aware of internment,
Right.
during World War II, and things like that. And for me, the thing I always push back on is this idea. It's like, well, they have these superpowers and they can do this thing, well, how do we know they won't go bad? But you can make that argument about anybody to a certain extent. I mean, if somebody really wants to, they can get together some fertilizer and diesel fuel and load up the back of a U-Haul truck and park it next to a federal building. I mean, I absolutely agree that it's dealing with that fear that it sort of takes normal life that, we don't police people who haven't done anything wrong yet, and really says, okay, but what if instead of this person being a number 5 threat, they're a 9 threat, or a 12. And I mean, even in the case like Superman, what can you really do to Superman? If Superman turned himself in, if something went wrong, he's like, okay, I'm going to turn myself in and go to jail. He's not really in jail.
Right.
No,
he's just hanging out there because he has agreed to. There is nothing restraining him if he doesn't want to be there anymore.
it's true.
So I mean, that's why I think it's a threat level too, right? Because I mean, there's very much a difference between what Captain America can unleash on somebody and what Havoc can release on somebody, right? You know, or Sunspot. You know, it's you've got varying degrees of destructive capability. You know, and that was something I always wanted to see delved a little bit more into the nuance of that, at least in the movies. You know, which it kind of I think starts to get into that with WandaVision. You know, that at the end it comes to it's like, okay, who's really going to try and arrest her after she brainwashed an entire town to deal with her grief? Sorry, spoiler warning. You know, that it you've got to add that nuance that it's like, okay, well, yeah, we want to police these people. Well, you got to ask, can you police these people? Because if you need superheroes to fight supervillains, how are you possibly going to control the superheroes?
Right.
Well, Claremont and I think John Byrne answered that about, it's probably been 20 years ago, in Days of Future Past in the X-Men book, because they had the Sentinels, which could control the mutants.
Right.
And then in Dark Knight Returns, the Frank Miller miniseries, Superman was on the side of the government and was not pleased when Batman came out of retirement, because it's kind of like, look, you need to get on board or we can't let you operate, kind of thing.
Well, but if we look again at the Civil War scenario, that made perfect sense to me, because you have Captain America, literally Captain America, and while he is the ultimate Boy Scout, he also recognizes he's a product of the US government, made to fix a problem at a particular time, that the ethos of which was really questionable about how they made him, even though they sold it to him. You know, he wanted to be the hero. They made him a hero, but it was really questionable, the ethos of what they did. And he's seen how the government comes in, and even for the best of theirs, how they get treated. I can understand that. Then you look at Tony, because Tony was willing to come and step out of the Iron Man suit and say, yeah, it's me, Tony Stark, billionaire, bring it on. But that's where Tony's ego also separates him. The human fear part of him was like, yeah, I want to know who everybody else is, so I know how to trap them. And that was really the pure representation of kind of the government and that side. Even though Tony had been in conflict with the government, they shared the same motivations and goals, just not in the same way. And I think that was a big part of what we saw in the interplay, was the Boy Scout going, no, you really can't always trust the powers that be, and Tony looking at it for trusting it for the moment.
Right. And doesn't that really kind of speak to the different backgrounds too? Because you've got somebody like Tony Stark, who is just marinated in privilege from a very young age. So of course the government and the authorities and everything like that were always beneficial for him. He never saw any bad side of it. Whereas, you know, Steve grew up poor, you know, and grew up in a time where there was corruption, and, you know, you still believed in the government, but you still also could recognize the fact that their power still got abused.
And to me, there is one other inherent statement. If you can control the superheroes with all of their power and abilities, what's the average person going to do?
Right.
Which is part of the need of the vigilante, is to then be there when those you can't deal with are the point of conflict.
Well,
these
we're
are
actually
wonderful shades of gray. I love this stuff.
We're coming up on time. Does anybody want to talk about anything else before we close it out?
I actually think that addressing the Punisher directly, because I actually think that he is such a deep end case compared to most of the other heroes, because most of them at least make an effort not to kill the people they're trying to arrest. And the Punisher specifically sets out to kill the people that he arrests. And I think that he's worth sort of delving into even lightly just for a little bit, because he is such the opposite end of the spectrum. You know, it's like all the other superheroes may be on the shade of gray. He is definitely in the black. You know, the only thing that makes him not a villain is it's criminals that he's killing. You know what I mean? I mean, it's if it was anybody else, he would be a villain that the other superheroes were trying to take down. That's why I think he's worth exploring at least a little bit in that it's, is he even really a hero? Which, I mean, that's kind of the point of his comic, right? Is that's always the question.
But he has to be infallible.
Right.
He always has to be right about the people he comes after, because the first time he's not, that justification is gone.
Right. Yeah, he becomes the villain at that point, and I think that he's also, so inflected with, sort of the PTSD and all of those other issues that, to me, that always separates him out. It makes him the anti-hero who's attempting to administer justice in his own way, but he's been just as damaged by governmental forces as some of the others that we've been talking about. So
I just think it's funny that DC a number of years ago actually had a character in an ongoing series called Vigilante. I don't know whatever happened to him. He was in like a black ski suit with a pistol and goggles. And I just always thought it was funny that they invent this guy and call him Vigilante. It's like if they invented a new character and called him Superhero. Yeah, you and how many other, characters are that? So
Vigilante wasn't the cowboy guy?
Yeah, there was that too, but this was a thing like in the late 70s, early 80s in a black suit with a ski mask and a pistol. It was like a 12-issue thing. It ran during the DC explosion and then imploded. But I read a couple of issues, and I just always remember thinking, this is some dude running around with a gun. Just is, it's not. He wasn't. He was nowhere near Punisher level. So what was the point? It was
Captain on the nose.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of funny. I don't know. Did any of you ever play the City of Heroes video game?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I always thought it was funny that you fight the bad guys in it, and when you their health goes away, they get teleported to the police. You never actually kill any of the bad guys. That was very explicitly explained in the instructions. That it's like, no, you're not killing bad guys. Even if you're walking around throwing fire and shooting guns and lobbing missiles at them, you're not killing them. You're just incapacitating them so they can be teleported to the police.
A sop to concerned parents, perhaps.
Yes, probably.
Well, does anybody else want to add anything about the Punisher or anything else?
Well, like I say, I think the Punisher, and I have always enjoyed the Punisher, is because it is in so many ways walking that very fine line between in the red and in the black. Because either way, it's going to be bloody. Either way, he's going in and lays out to hit a hard target. But it's always that edge of, if law enforcement gets too close, he's going to try to get away. But he's always been pretty good about his self-preservation stops at a point. And I think that's what still maintains a degree there of being at least the anti-hero and not just the outright weapon of destruction. Because if you flip that switch and he becomes the outright weapon of destruction, then he's gone past redeemability. He hovers just on that edge, teetering just to that edge, dips his toe over every now and then, but still has that edge where we want to see him redeemed after he cleans up all the messes.
Well, there was a Punisher movie quite some years ago starring Thomas Jane.
Mm-hmm.
I like that one.
And he went after John Travolta. And that's the first time I ever saw John Travolta play a villain. And I have to say, I thought he did it really well. The mob boss who ordered the hit on Frank Castle's family. And then so the whole movie was about Frank Castle trying to avenge his family. And so it's easy to root for that, even if you don't really.
Right. Well, because in the comics, his family dies of a random act of violence. It's not a targeted hit. It's just, the chaos of the world. Right. That's a good point that Jim made that I didn't think about, that it's in terms of where he still draws the line of having a moral code, so to speak. And it made me think of the response that I can't think of the artist's name that he did of the Punisher to some police officers putting the Punisher logo on their squad cars, to where he basically, the cops are like, "Hey, Frank, way to go," or "Hey, Punisher, we're rooting for you." And he basically gets up in their face and says, "If you start rooting for me, I'm coming after you, because that makes you part of the problem. I wouldn't be necessary if you did the job the way you were supposed to."
Ooh.
You can do a Google search for that. It's great. Just the few panels of it. I think that really kind of nails to where his honor code, his morality line is.
It was a great moment of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Anybody have anything else they'd like to add? No? Well, then why don't we wrap up and let's let everyone tell us where people can find information about your work. If you have a project that's recently out or coming out that you're excited about, share that with us. And Bishop, we'll start with you.
You can find me on my blog, quietpint.com, all one word. I'm also on Facebook and on the Twitters as Bishop M. O'Connell, so that I stand out from the various high schools around the country. You can find out about my American Fairy Tale series. I have a novella that is Christmas themed that is available right now on ebook called The Greatest Gift of All, that's set in the American Fairy Tale universe. And I have a fantasy western historical fantasy coming out sometime next year, hopefully the early part of next year, called The Two-Gun Witch, that is sort of elves and dwarves in post-Civil War America. Yeah, so that's me.
Okay, Jim?
You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, of course, here at ConTinual. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, occasionally the hiveless company that is Twitter. Right now, I am anxiously awaiting, I'm in a collection on fairy films about fairy folklore in film, and my piece in that book is all about Dune. So I really wish it was in hand right now while the big, while everything's going on around Dune. But so that's my next release. And of course, since we're in the holiday season, you can pick up my book, The Krampus Claus.
Van?
The current things are my comic book, Pulsar Blind Date, is on Kickstarter right now for about 2 more weeks. Already funded. We're in stretch goals and stuff, which is really cool. One-shot adventure with the main character from the Sentinels novels. And I've got my heist novel, my second heist novel, Miami Heist, is coming out on Audible. It's been out in paperback for a year, but the Audible should be out any day now. I'm very excited about that. Sounds really good. Pete Mylan did the performance. But otherwise, just go to www.plexico.net, plexico.net, and there's links to all the podcasts, all the books, all the audio books, all the videos, all the convention schedule, all the various things that I do, plexico.net. And the other thing is we've got a big anthology that I'm editing, co-created with Kurt Busick, called Gideon Kane Demon Hunter, and that's going to be out probably in January or February.
Okay, Jenny?
Well, I'm on Facebook. You can also find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle's at Jennifer Swartz 2. And, I found my email address can be found at lec.edu. That's the Lake Erie College website. And well, I've got some projects in the pipeline right now. Nothing ready for prime time to share tonight. So
You can find me here at ConTinual, or you can get information about me and about my work at nancynorthcott.com. And I spend far more time on Twitter than is good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott there. And my latest release is historical fantasy set in the 100 days between Napoleon's escape from Elba and the Battle of Waterloo from Falstaff Books, and that's called The Steel Rose. So thank you to everyone for joining me for this panel and discussion, and thank you for everyone who's watching. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention.